Well, I've been wanting to do another book, and yeah, I seem to learn or comprehend a lot more when I read it out loud. But I feel dumb reading out loud if I'm not recording it because it just seems stupid to do it. But it doesn't make much sense to record it either. But I'm not concerned with that. I think I'm going to do this book called Tertium or Organum. You can see that. So, that is the book. I think it was written in 1922 by a Russian, P.D. Ospensky. I don't know much about him. This was recommended by someone. His name is Jason Bashir of Archaics, and I really dig what he's laying out there right now. And yeah, he said he read this book 6 times while he was in prison. And I thought, well, hell, I'll give it a shot at least once. And yeah, look into it if you want to follow along. I'm going to shoot for like a chapter a day, but I don't think I'm going to make it. I'm just going to go. I'll figure it out as I go. But yeah, just giving you guys a heads up if you see this stuff coming out. I'm going to start at page 1. It's annotated. I don't think I'm going to read the annotations, but I am going to read the introductions and stuff. So let me start at page 1. Let me get it. I got my little thingamajigger here. Yeah, we'll go like that. All right. Tertium Organum. Annotated. The third canon of thought, a key to the enigmas of the world. P.D. Ospensky, translated from the Russian by Nicholas Bessarabov and Claude Bragdon, with an introduction by Claude Bragdon, 1922, an introduction by Jeff Carrera, 2022. Yeah, it looks like originally published in Russian in 1912. So it's old. Introduction to this edition by Jeff Carrera. The book you hold in your hands is an amazing volume of work. It should perhaps be considered a masterpiece, and it certainly shows the genius of its author at an early age of his life. But I must warn you, it is not an easy book to read, and why should it be? It is a book about a higher dimension of consciousness, after all. A dimension of being that is completely invisible to our familiar senses, but which can be entered into by adopting a dramatically different way of thinking. I felt compelled to publish this edition of Tertium Organum, the third canon of thought, a key to the enigmas of the world, because of the effect the book had on me when I read it. I found the book through a circuitous route. I was doing research for my own book called The Path of Cosmic Consciousness when I found that what I thought was an essay by P.D. Ospensky called The Cosmic Consciousness of Dr. Richard M. Buck. I read the essay and found that many of Ospensky's criticisms of Buck's generally magnificent treatment on the subject perfectly aligned with my own feelings. I knew Ospensky, as most people do, as the primary disciple of the Russian mystic George Ivanovich G.I. Gurdjieff, and author of In Search of the Miraculous, still considered by many to be the most accessible explanation of Gurdjieff's teachings. I was aware that Ospensky was reported to be a major intellectual figure in his own right before meeting Gurdjieff, but whatever prominence he may have had in those earlier years seemed to have been eclipsed by the fame he attained as a disciple of his Russian teacher. I was delighted to discover that what I had assumed was an essay was in fact the last chapter of a much larger work called Tertium Organum. I immediately bought a copy of the book and started reading it. I was daunted by the complexity and subtlety of the ideas being conveyed and the density of some of the passages, and yet I could not stop reading. In fact, I became obsessed with the book and its author. I read a biography of Ouspensky, written by the 20th century mystical philosopher Colin Wilson, and I learned that there was a much more to the man than I had been aware of. His early life is unremarkable. He was expelled from school at a young age for a prank and seems to have been self-educated from that time on. He worked as a journalist and published his first book, The Fourth Dimension, in 1909. The idea of the fourth dimension of reality had captivated Ouspensky's imagination, and in that he was not alone. The notion of the fourth dimension was fashionable at the turn of the century. An English schoolmaster, Edwin A. Abbott, had published his humorous yet profound treatment of the subject in a little book called Flatland in 1884. And Abbott's friend, the mathematician Charles Howard Hinton, published extensively on the fourth dimension in the decades immediately following. Hinton's writing was especially influential on Ouspensky. The idea of the fourth dimension was not just popular among mathematicians. In fact, its wider popularity was mainly fueled by the embrace of the idea among adherents to spiritualism, which was at the peak of its influence at that time. Spiritualism is a worldview based on the idea that those who have died still exist outside of our normal perceptions and that communication with them is possible. From the 1840s through the first few decades of the 20th century, the spiritualist movement grew in popularity. Seances, trance, mediums, and other esoteric practitioners abounded in American and Europe. The spiritualist movement saw a more scientifically palatable understanding for supernatural occurrences. The growth of science had undermined the credibility of the church, and many people were looking for a more rational basis for their faith in a world beyond an ordinary senses. The idea of the fourth dimension was tailor-made for spiritualism. Those who had died were not gone. They had simply slipped into another dimension of reality beyond the three that we customarily have access to. Many of the supernatural occurrences that spiritualists were fascinated by seemed to be explained perfectly by the reality of the fourth dimension of existence. Ouspensky's interest in the fourth dimension, and what captivated me about his thinking, was the perspective it offered on spiritual enlightenment. I would now like to give you my interpretation of the wisdom I found in Tertium Organum. Building on the essential insight of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, Ouspensky tells us that what we experience as time and space are not experiences of the way reality is, but rather of the way we have learned to interpret it. Time and space are categories of thinking that we have learned to apply to what our senses perceive. We learn to think in terms of time and space, and more specifically in terms of linear time and three-dimensional space, and therefore that is what we see in the world around us. The premise of Ouspensky's book is that since we learn to think in three dimensions, we can also learn to think in four dimensions, and in doing so expand our perception of reality. Before he became famous for teaching Gurdjieff's spiritual work called The Fourth Way, Ouspensky was already teaching a fourth way of thinking. That Gurdjieff's name is spelled Gurdjieff, if anyone wants to look him up. In this book, Ouspensky explores the nature and character of four-dimensional reality. He explains that two-dimensional squares become the surfaces of a three-dimensional cube, and our three-dimensional world is likewise the surface of a four-dimensional reality. Every place and every moment that exists in linear time in our three-dimensional reality is directly accessible to any other place and time through the fourth dimension. If we change the way we think about reality, we can open our perception to the true interconnected oneness of the fourth dimension. In this book, Ouspensky quotes from the writings of great realizers of different eras and different traditions, including Richard Maurice Buch's experience of cosmic consciousness to show how their mystical revelations can be understood as openings to the fourth dimension. I must admit that it took some perseverance to read Ouspensky's book, and there are parts of it that continue to be opaque to me. But my efforts were rewarded when I had a glimpse of what he was describing. I saw how everything around me, including my own body, was a three-dimensional surface that in the impossible dimension beyond the three we are familiar with, there is an entirely different universe awaiting us. I saw in that glimpse the vision that had driven Ouspensky's strange and extraordinary life. The story of the book's publication and introduction to an English-speaking audience is almost as fascinating as its content. Tertium, Organum was originally published in Russia in 1912 and brought Ouspensky to some degree of prominence among the reading public. A copy of the book in Russian was brought to the United States by a fan named Nicholas Bessarabov, who gave it to an American named Claude Bragdon, who was an enthusiast of the fourth dimension and could read Russian. Together, the two translated the book into English and Bragdon published it. The book was immediately popular and was quickly picked up and published by the large publishing house of Alfred A. Knopf. No one involved with the book knew how to find Ouspensky in Russia, but Bragdon did track the author down some years later, paid him back royalties, and informed him that his book was something of a sensation overseas. By the time Ouspensky learned of his book's popularity in the West, he had already traveled through India, Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka, and Egypt in search of true knowledge. It was only after he was forced to return to Moscow because of the outbreak of war that he met Gurdjieff. Ouspensky soon realized that Gurdjieff's system of development, called the Fourth Way, harmonized work on emotions, the intellect, and the body into one complete system. This was the training for higher dimensional awakening that Ouspensky had been seeking for. He would become a disciple of Gurdjieff and teach his master's system for the next 25 years until the end of his life. Even after he officially broke ties with Gurdjieff, he continued to reach the work, and the two mystics remained on friendly terms. In the waning years of his life, Ouspensky appeared to become increasingly depressed because he felt the fourth dimensional awakening that he dedicated his life to had eluded him. To many who had known him, he seemed embittered and cynical. But in the last weeks of his life, a miraculous transformation seems to have occurred in his consciousness. He was ill and on his deathbed, attended by some of his close students, when suddenly those around him felt that he was communicating with them telepathically. The downloads of knowledge that his students were experiencing from their teacher at times became so rapid and intense that they would ask him to stop. His demeanor in those last days shifted and lightness overcame him. Those who knew him best believed that he had finally attained cosmic consciousness and his awareness had moved into the fourth dimension. I love this powerful, beautiful, and challenging book. I love the idea that it attempts to convey, and I love the story of the man who wrote it. P.D. Ouspensky is someone that I would call an artist of possibility. He was inspired by a universe of being that he knew existed just beyond the surface of the familiar. He pursued that reality during his entire life. He became Gurdjieff's greatest ambassador and supporter. He experienced numerous spiritual breakthroughs, and in the end, it seems he entered the miraculous state of awareness that he had been seeking for. I am happy and proud to offer you this edition of Ouspensky's book. You will find the writing to be infused with a vision of possibility that is explored with a keen intellect and a seeker's wide-open heart. I suggest reading this book vulnerably, without trying to understand every idea that is presented. As you go through it, allow yourself to be comfortable with those parts of it that you do not understand, but also allow yourself to be pulled into those sections that speak to you. Pay attention to the attractive power that the book might exert on you. Feel how it lures you into the miraculous, tempting you to believe in the impossible. And if you look out the corner of your eyes, you might even see the shimmering of the fourth dimension just beyond the surface of the three dimensions you are familiar with. Jeff Carrera, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, July 2022. Author's Preface to the Second Edition by P. Ouspensky. In revising Tertium Organum for the second edition in English, my chief concern has been to coordinate its terminology with the more developed terminology of those of my books written after the publication of the second Russian edition of Tertium Organum, from which the English translation was made. Such a unity of terminology is the more necessary because I am obliged to lead the reader into regions of thought and knowledge where boundaries have not been clearly established, and where different authors, and often one and the same author in different works and during different periods of his activity, have called the same thing by different names, or different things by the same name. It must be admitted that language is a weak and inadequate vehicle even for the expression of our usual understanding of things, to say nothing of those moments when the understanding unexpectedly expands and becomes deeper, and we see revealed an entire series of facts and relations for the description of which we have neither words nor expressions. But quite aside from this, in ordinary conditions of thinking and feeling, we are frequently at a loss for words, and we use one word at different times to describe different things. On the other hand, it is no merit in an author to invent new words, or to use old words in new meanings which have nothing in common with the accepted ones, to create, in other words, a special terminology. I have always considered that it is necessary to write in the language which men commonly speak, and I have endeavored to do this, although in some cases it has been necessary to make some additions to and corrections of that language for the sake of exactness and lucidity. In due time I shall separately consider the subject of language and the methods of its adaptation for the transmission of exact thought. For the present I have referenced only to the language of Tertium Organum. The first word demanding a more careful use is consciousness. In conversational language and in everyday psychology, even in psychology purporting to be scientific, the word consciousness is often used as a term for the designation of a complex of all psychic functions in general, or for their separate manifestations. At present, I have not access to the necessary books. I abandoned them all in Petrograd 4 years ago, but to the best of my recollection, Professor William James defined thought as a moment of consciousness. From my standpoint, which I shall elucidate in works now being prepared for the press, it is necessary to regard consciousness as distinct from the commonly understood psychic functions, thought, feeling, and sensation. Over and above all this, consciousness has several exactly definable forms or phrases, in each one of which thoughts, feelings, and sensations can function, giving in each different results. Thus, consciousness, be it this or something other, is a background upon which thoughts, feelings, and sensations reveal themselves. This background can be more or less bright, but as thoughts, feelings, and sensations have their own separate life and can be regarded independently of this background, so can it be regarded and studied independently of them. For the present, I shall not insist too strongly upon the idea of this ground as something separate in its substance from psychic functions. The practical result is the same if we say the thoughts, feelings, and sensations may have a different character, and that thoughts, feelings, and sensations of this or that character create this or that state of consciousness. It is important only to establish the fact that thoughts, feelings, and sensations, i.e., psychic functions, are not consciousness, and that this or that state of consciousness is something pertaining to them, but separate from them, and in some cases capable of being separately observed. In the early editions of Tertium Organum, I have used the word consciousness in its generally accepted meaning, i.e., as a complex of psychic functions, or in the sense of their indication and contents. But as in my future works, it will be necessary for me to use the word consciousness in its real and true meaning. I have tried in this revised text of Tertium Organum to substitute for the word consciousness wherever it is used in the sense of a complex of psychic functions, such other words as psyche or psychic life, which perfectly express my meaning in such cases. Furthermore, in my work of revision, I have found numerous instances of illustrations, examples, etc., having no direct connection with the main theme. I have found also that some of these introduced themes vitiate the correctness of the main line of thought, creating associations which lead too far away. Other themes also, accidentally touched upon, demand a considerably more extended treatment than can be given them within the limits of this book, but being inadequately developed, they leave a wrong impression. In such cases, I consider it necessary to eliminate this extraneous matter in order to elucidate the principal thought more clearly and directly, particularly as some of the questions touched upon demanding more different exposition are discussed at length in my forthcoming books. In conclusion, let me express to Mr. Nicholas Bessaraboff and to Mr. Claude Bragdon my deep appreciation of their labors on the translation of my book into English. This translation, made without my knowledge and participation at a time when I was cut off by war and revolution from the civilized world, transmits my thought so exactly that after a very attentive review of the book, I could find only one word to correct. Such a result could be achieved only because Mr. Bessaraboff and Mr. Bragdon were not translating words merely, but were grasping directly the thoughts back of them. Also, it is especially pleasant for me to remember that a number of years ago, Mr. Bragdon's man, the Square, reached me in Petrograd, and that I, not knowing Mr. Bragdon's other works at all, selected this little book from a whole series received from abroad, as one which carried the message of common thought and a common understanding. P. Ouspensky, Constantinople, June 1921. All right, one more introduction. How long is this one? All right, I'll get them out of the way. Introduction to the English Translation by Claude Bragdon. In naming his book, Tertium Organum, Ouspensky reveals at a stroke that astounding audacity which characterizes his thought throughout, an audacity which we are accustomed to associate with the Russian mind in all its phases. Such a title says, in effect, here's a book which will recognize all knowledge. The Organum of Aristotle formulated the laws under which the subject thinks. The Novum Organum of Bacon, the laws under which the object may be known. But the third canon of thought existed before these two, and ignorance of its laws does not justify their violation. Tertium Organum shall guide and govern human thought henceforth. How passing strange in this era of negative thinking, of timid philosophizing, does such a challenge sound, and yet it has the echo in it of something heard before. What but the title of another volume, Hinton's A New Era of Thought? Ouspensky's Tertium Organum and Hinton's A New Era of Thought present substantially the same philosophy, though Hinton's book only sketchily arrived at the same route, mathematics. Here is food for thought. In the words of Philip Henry Wynne, mathematics possesses the most potent and perfect symbolism the intellect knows, and this symbolism has offered for generations certain concepts of which hyperdimensionality is only one, whose naming and oh, that's a tough word. Envisagement by the human intellect is perhaps its loftiest achievement. Mathematics presents the highest certitudes known to the intellect and is becoming more and more the final arbiter and interpreter of in physics, chemistry, and astronomy. Like Aaron's rod, it threatens to swallow all other knowledges as fast as they assume organized form. Mathematics has already taken possession of great providences of logic and psychology. Will it embrace ethics, religion, and philosophy? In Tertium Organum, mathematics enters and pervades the field of philosophy, but so adroitly, so silently as it were, that one hardly knows that it is there. It dwells more in Ouspensky's method than in his matter, because, for the most part, the mathematical ideas necessary for an understanding of his thesis are such as any intelligent high school student can comprehend. The author puts to himself and to the reader certain questions, propounds certain problems which have baffled the human mind for thousands of years. The problems of space, time, motion, causality, of free will, and determination, and he deals with them according to the mathematical method. That is all. He has sensed the truth that the problem of mathematics is the problem of the world order, and as such must deal with every aspect of human life. Mathematics is a terrible word for those whose taste and training have led them into other fields, so lest the non-mathematical reader should be turned back at the very threshold, deciding too hastily that the book is not for him, let me dwell rather on its richly humanistic aspect. To such as ask no, To such as ask no, key to the enigmas of the world, but only some light to live by, some mitigation of the daily grind, some glimpse of the more enlightened that's polity, than that which rules the world today. This book should have an appeal. The author has thrown overboard all the jargon of all the schools. He uses the language of common sense and of every day. His illustrations and figures of speech are homely, taken from the life of every day. He simply says to the reader, "Come, let us reason together," and leads him away from the haunted jungle of philosophical systems and metaphysical theories out into the light of day, there to contemplate and to endeavor to understand those primal mysteries which puzzle the mind of child or of a savage no less than that of the sophisticated and supersubtle ponderer on the enigmas of the world. Not that Ouspensky is a trafficker in the obvious, far from it. Those who know most, think most, feel most, will get most out of this book, but the great sanity pervades his pages, and he never leads away into labyrinths where guide and follower alike lose their way and fail to come to any end. Leaving the average reader out of account for the moment, there are certain others whom the book should particularly interest, if only in the way of repulsion. First of all come the mathematicians and the theoretical physicists, for they already, without knowing it, have invaded the dark, backward, and abysm of time, which the Ouspenskyan philosophy lights up, and are by way of losing themselves there. That is to say, in certain of their calculations, they are employing 4 mutually interchangeable coordinates, 3 of space and 1 of time. In other words, they use time as though it were a dimension of space. Ouspensky tells them the reason they are able to do this. Time is the 4th dimension of space and perfectly sensed, apprehended by consciousness successfully, and thereby successively, not successfully. Let me say that again. Time is the 4th dimension of space, imperfectly sensed, apprehended by consciousness successively and thereby creating the temporal illusion. Moreover, mathematicians are perforce concerning themselves with magnitudes to which the ordinary logic no longer applies. Ouspensky presents a new logic, or rather, he presents a new and ancient logic, the logic of intuition, removing at a stroke all of the nightmare aspects, the preposterous paradoxes of the new mathematics, which by reason of its extraordinary development has shattered the old logic, as a growing oak shatters the containing jar. It is from the philosophic camp, no doubt, that the book will receive its sharpest criticism on account of the author's lèse-majesté towards so many of the crowned kings of philosophic thought, and his devastating assault on positivism, that inevitable byproduct of our materialistic way of looking at the world. His attempt to prove the Kantian problem, the subjectivity of space and time, doubtless will be acutely challenged, and with some chance of success, because the 2 chapters devoted to this are perhaps the least convincing of the book. But no one heretofore has even attempted to demonstrate absolutely or successfully to controvert the staggering proposition advanced by Kant regarding space and time as forms of consciousness. Kant is spelled K-A-N-T. Whatever the verdict of the philosophical pundits of the day and hour, whether favorable or otherwise, Ouspensky is sure of a place in the hierarchy of philosophers, for he has essayed to solve the most profound problems of human existence by the aid of the binocular vision of the mathematician and the mystic. Starting from the irreducible minimum of knowledge, he has carried philosophy into regions not hitherto explored. To persons of an artistic or devotional bent, the book will be as water to the desert, in the desert. These, always at a disadvantage among the purely practical-minded, by whom they are overwhelmingly outnumbered, will find in Ouspensky a champion whose weapon is mathematical certitude, the very thing by which the practical-minded swear. These he puts to rout, holds up to ridicule, and applauds every effort to escape into the world of the wondrous. But most of Ouspensky will be loved by all true lovers. For his chapter on the subject of love, we have had Schopenhauer on love and Freud on love, but what dusty answers do they give to the soul of the lover? Edward Carpenter comes much nearer the mark, but Ouspensky penetrates to its very center. It is because our loves are so dampened by our egotisms, our cynicisms, and our cowardices that we rot and smolder instead of bursting into purifying flame. Just as Goethe's Werther, with its sex sentimentality, is said to have provoked an epidemic of suicides, so may Tertium Organum, which restores love to that high heaven from whence descend every beauty and benison, inaugurate and renaissance of love. Renaissance of love and joy. From one point of view, this is a terrible book. There is a revolution in it, the revolution of the very poles of thought. Some it will rob of their dearest illusions. It will cut the very ground from beneath their feet. It will consign them to the abyss. It is a great destroyer of complacency. Yes, this is a dangerous book, but then life is like that. It is beyond the province of this introduction either to outline the Ouspenskyan philosophy at any length or to discuss it critically, but some slight indication of its drift may be of assistance to the reader. The book might have appropriately been called A Study of Consciousness, for Ouspensky comes early to the conclusion that all other methods of approach to an understanding of the enigmas of the world are vain. Chapters 1 through 7 inclusive deal with the problem of the world order by the objective method. The author erects an elaborate scaffolding for his future edifice, and after it has served its purpose, throws it down. Aware of the deficiencies of the objective method and having made the reader conscious of them too, he suddenly alters his system of attack. From chapter 8 onward, he undertakes the study of the world order from the standpoint of subjectivity of consciousness. By a method both ingenious and new, he correlates the different grades of consciousness observable in nature, those of vegetable, animal and man, with the space sense, showing that as consciousness changes and develops, the sense of space changes and develops too. That is to say, the dimensionality of the world depends on the development of consciousness. Man, having reached the third stage in that development, has a sense of three-dimensional space, and for no other reason. Ouspensky concludes that nothing except consciousness unfolds, develops, and as there appears to be no limit in this development, he conceives of space as the multidimensional mirror of consciousness and of time and motion as illusion. What appears to be time and motion being in reality only the movement of consciousness upon a higher space. The problem of superior states of consciousness in which there shall be time no longer is thus directly opened up, and in discussing their nature and method of attainment, he quotes freely from the rich literature of mysticism. Instead of attempting to rationalize these higher states of consciousness, as some authors do, he applies to them the logic of intuition, Tertium Organum, paradoxical from the standpoint of ordinary reason, but true in relation to the nominal world. Nominal world. Joseph Conrad and Ford Madox Hueffer once wrote a novel called The Inheritors, and by this they meant the people of the fourth dimension. Though there is small resemblance between Ouspensky's Superman and theirs, it is his idea also that those of this world who succeed in developing higher dimensional or cosmic consciousness will indeed inherit, will control and regulate human affairs by reason of their superior wisdom and power. In this, and in this alone, dwells the salvation of the world. His Superman is the just man made perfect, of the evangelist. The struggle for mastery between the blind and unconscious forces of materialism on the one hand and the spiritually illumined on the other is already upon us, and all conflicts between nations, peoples, and classes must now be interpreted in terms of this greater warfare between two races of men, in which the superior minority will either conquer or disappear. These people of the fourth dimension are in the world but not of it. Their range is far wider than this slum of space. In them, dormant faculties are alert. Like birds of the air, their fitting symbol, they are at home in realms which others cannot enter, even though already there. Nor are these heavenly eagles confined to the narrow prison of the breast. Their bodies are as tools which they may take up or lay aside at will. This phenomenal world, which seems so real, is to them as insubstantial as the image of a landscape in a lake. Such is the Ouspensky been saying the guy's name 100 times. I can't say it now. Ouspensky Superman. The entire book is founded upon a new generalization. New, that is, in philosophy, but already familiar to mathematicians and theoretical physicists. The generalization involves startling and revolutionary ideas in regard to space, time, and motion far removed from those of Euclidean geometry and classical physics. Ouspensky handles these new ideas in an absolutely original way, making them the basis of an entire philosophy of life. To the timid and the pure-blind, this philosophy will be nothing short of terrifying, but to the clear-eyed and steadfast watcher, shipwrecked on this shoal of time, these vistas overflowing with beauty, strangeness, doubt, terror, and divinity will be more welcome than anything in life. Fear not the new generalization. Ouspensky's clearness of thought is mirrored in corresponding clarity of expression. He sometimes repeats the difficult and important passages in altered form of words. He uses short sentences and short paragraphs and italicizes significant phrases and significant words. He defines where definition is needed and suggests collateral trains of thought with a skill which makes the reader who is intuitive as a creator on his own account. Schopenhauer has said that it is always a sign of genius to treat difficult matters simply, as it is a sign of dullness to make simple matters appear recondite. Ouspensky exhibits this order of genius, and that other, mentioned by Schopenhauer, which consists in choosing always the apt illustration, the illuminating simile. The translators have tried to be rigidly true to the Russian original, and they have been at great pains to verify every English quotation so far as has been possible. It is therefore a source of great gratification to them that their efforts should have received the unqualified endorsement of the author himself. Claude Bragdon, Rochester, New York, January 31st, 1922. And that concludes all, what are these called? Introductions. So the next one, I'll start chapter 1. And I don't know how far I'll get. We will see. But one thing's for sure, I'll just continue to do it. So, see you later.